I think we will just start. It's giving people some extra time to arrive. It is a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's lecture by Eleni Volonaki, and we are very pleased to have you with us here. She is Professor of Ancient Greek Literature in the Department of Philology at the University of Peloponnese, and she is a Deputy Director of the Center for the Art of Rhetoric and Drama there. And she is teaching both undergraduate and postgraduates, and her specialism is Attic oratory, and I would just like to show you her book on two of the speeches by Lysias. And also another book that she has translated by Christopher Carey, her PhD supervisor, on democracy in classical Athens, of which of course oratory and rhetoric formed a very important part. She has also done other translations and published articles on Athenian and Greek law and forensic and epidictic oratory and rhetoric more in general, on Hellenistic poetry, epic poetry, and social values. So it's a literary focus with asking the broader questions about the place of literature and oratory in culture and society. This is why we're very much looking forward to your lecture, which is The Art of Persuasion. That's the title. And thank you for coming all the way up from Kalamata for tonight and fitting that in to your very busy schedule. Professor Volonaki is a very active professor who organizes lots of things and does lots of things all the time, so we are very, very privileged to have you with us here tonight.
Thank you very much. I would first like to thank the director of Norwegian Institute of Athens, Euron Auckland, for this kind invitation and your kind words he just said for me, as well as Delia Trotzaki for all the communication we shared before coming here. It is a great pleasure to be here. Actually, it's my first time in this institute, and I'm amazed from the whole environment, and thank you very much all of you who came here tonight to share a few views on the art of persuasion, which is rhetoric. I suppose each one of us might have different expectations on what is going to be said today, because rhetoric is about everything. And we hear recently, the last 20 years, I suppose, there has been in literature and classics, and I suppose more generally by scholars, there's a focus on the art of rhetoric and how it is used, how it can be important in all different periods from the classical, archaic classical Athens today. There is even rhetoric of cooking. There is rhetoric of how of engineering. There is rhetoric in every aspect. You want to persuade something, and basically the recent years is to persuade to buy or ideas or goods or views or politics. I will start, before starting my official lecture, which I have not opened yet. My approach, my view, if you want to start with this, is that there is a crisis of rhetoric today. And because of this, there is a crisis of politics as well. And I think this is globally. It's not only in Greece, it's not only in Europe, it's everywhere. So the question is why? There is, first of all, I believe everybody has to accept that there is this crisis. Even though speech is everywhere, even though we have the technology and we have the means to know different ways and means of persuasion, still there is this crisis, and the question is why. So what I will try to do today, and then it would be a pleasure if I have a discussion with you, of course, on this, is to see how this art started in classical Greece, what is the context, and what is the evolution, both in context and in thought. Because for me, the art of persuasion is a dynamic art which always evolves, and it continues to evolve even today. So looking at the classical time, the question is if that structure or that frame or that context can be of any help for us today to understand why we have this crisis. So this is my whole point of view. The Greeks, in their high archaic and classical period, placed a high value on effective speaking from as early as Homer, and undoubtedly much earlier. Achilles, who was the bravest warrior of all Greeks, and whose greatness was primarily established on the battlefield, was brought up to be a speaker of words and a doer of deeds. Similarly, Athenian leaders of the 6th and 5th century, such as Solon, Themistocles, and Pericles, were all accomplished orators. The culture of the ancient Greeks was associated with an oral tradition, and their whole political and social experience was based on orality. Hence, the Athenians were exposed to oral speech, either as active citizens participating in the constitution, or as leaders, politicians, and generals who needed to persuade their audience, or finally as an audience themselves of dramatic festivals, or the Athenian assembly, or finally the Athenian courts. Most Greek literary genres, notably epic, tragedy, and history, give emphasis to the importance of oratory by their inclusion of set speeches. A few examples. The formal pleadings of the envoys to Achilles in the Iliad, when they try to persuade him to go back to the battlefield and fight for the Greeks. The messenger speeches in tragedy, reporting events like the Battle of Salamis in Aeschylus' Persians, or the horrible death of Pentheus in Euripides' Bacchae. The Agones Logon debates in Euripides' tragedies, consisting of arguments on both sides, such as a debate between Hecuba and Helen, or Eteocles and Polynices, where each hero defends himself, his position, and his action or decision. The same sort of debates are also found in the comedies of Aristophanes, where heroes contest with arguments so that the best will win. Finally, in historiography, we have the powerful political oratory of Pericles' funeral oration in Thucydides, which praises the city of Athens. These were a few of the most notable examples of the Greeks' fascination with formal public speaking. In order to understand how the significance of speech started to develop into a philosophical pursuit and how this evolved up to the systematic study of the art of rhetoric, we will examine briefly the historical background starting from the pre-Socratic philosophers and the Sophists, to continue with the teachers of rhetoric from Sicily, and finally with the 4th century school of rhetoric by Socrates. Philosophy, which simply means love of wisdom, can trace its roots to Miletus, an Ionian city in Asia Minor, where the first known philosophers speculated about nature, physis. They were concerned with the physical world. and wanted to understand its substance. The most famous of these Milesian and so-called pre-Socratic philosophers were Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. The Milesian school were not teachers by profession, but independent people who were curious as to the nature of the physical world. Later, they were followed by Heraclitus, Pythagoras, and others who tried to move the emphasis away from the mythical view of the world to a more rational one. Their approach to explaining the nature of the physical world may have partly led the next generation of thinkers towards the rational examination of human affairs. Many of this new generation of thinkers, who were mostly from outside Athens, found a source for their income in the education of young Athenians. The educational demand mostly reflected a desire for a sort of learning that would lead to political success. In early times, oratory was not a specialized subject of study, but was learned by practice. The formal study of rhetoric as an art, techni, began in the middle of the 5th century in Sicily. At that time in Sicily, there was a need for public speech due to a number of claims that went to court cases. As a result, a new school of oratory emerged. Corax, a Sicilian Greek, was perhaps one of the best-known rhetorists. His system divided a speech into the following basic parts: introduction, narrative, historical background, major arguments, subordinate arguments, and subsidiary remarks, and then summary. Corax is probably best known for developing the reverse probability argument, also known as the art of Corax. If a person is accused of a crime which he is not likely to have committed, for example, a small man, like me, physically attacking a large man, against whom he is almost certainly doomed to fail, his defense will be that it is unlikely that the crime occurred. His argument draws on the lack of means of the accused. However, if a person is accused of a crime which he is likely to have committed, in the case of a larger man attacking a smaller man, he can also use the defense that it is unlikely that he did it for the very reason that it appears too probable. This man draws on the lack of prospect of getting away unsuspected. It works by anticipating the audience's expectations and then combating that expectation with a counter move. This pattern of anticipating and then contradicting an audience's expectation has continued to be a typical move in reverse probability arguments to this day. Theseus was reputed to have been the pupil of the lawyer Corax and is said to have developed legal rhetoric upon the foundations laid by Corax's pioneering work in the field of philosophical argument. He is also believed to have been the teacher of Socrates. It has sometimes been asserted that Theseus and Corax are merely legendary persons. Moving now to the Sophists. As we will see immediately afterwards, Athenian democracy had developed more as a participatory than a representative process, and the political career was within reach of all young male citizens of ability. Also, litigation was central to the Athenian system of democracy as a means not only of solving disputes, but also of ensuring that those with privilege or in public administration were answerable to the courts. Consequently, a great need developed for people to be in a position to defend themselves. But they needed to be trained in how to persuade large groups of people and how to argue. The teachers of young Athenians who provided them the training in rhetoric and public oratory were the Sophists. The better one was at teaching persuasion, the more money one earned. Their priority was the pursuit of political influence by way of the techniques of persuasion. This group of teachers, who traditionally taught rhetoric, grammar, mathematics, poetry, history, and more especially virtue, in the sense that they taught their pupils how to perform the state functions, began to focus in on the teaching of rhetoric or the art of persuasion. They were basically seen by many as educators. The principal early sophists were Protagoras of Abdera, Gorgias of Leontini, Prodicus of Chios, and Hippias of Elis. They believed that the physical world was controlled by nature, but that the laws of the polis were human, and therefore they could be influenced by man. Likewise, they rejected the pre-Socratic belief that their cities had received their laws from some deity. Consequently, they upset those who held that to be a good citizen meant conforming to the laws, as they were divine and so eternal in nature. Also, they did not accept the old idea that excellence was inborn. Likewise, they did not accept that aristocratic birth alone qualified a young man for politics. They believed that excellence in political virtue and life was the result of training rather than birth. As there seemed to be no objective way in their approach, the sophists went along with the idea that everything was relative and that persuasion to one's point of view was all that there was. Since they did not accept the old explanations of the pre-Socratics and had no new certain ideas to offer, they became associated with the doubting of certainty. They doubted everything. To them, all things were relative: the logical concepts, the ethical values, religion, justice, the state, and so on. Therefore, they found little problem in teaching their students both sides of an argument, which would help them greatly in the political and legal systems that they were expected to form part of. Which argument was correct depended on which side of the argument you stood. For many sophists, there was no right or wrong answer. If there were no higher authority for morality, then surely depended on each person to decide. Protagoras, for example, here we have very briefly, Plato and Socrates, of course, opposed the work of sophists because Plato argued that knowledge may be assessed through reason, because the perfect form of the concept exists in the metaphysical, beyond the physical realm. Also, their big contradiction was that according to Plato, rhetoric is not an art, and that it's not an art because you pay to be trained for this, whereas the sophists believed that it was an art and was training the young Athenians to become politicians, and because they trained them to become politicians, also they taught them a virtue of political ethos. So there is, I just wanted to hint in this difference because it's a big issue and it's a subject for another lecture. So Protagoras, for example, taught his students to praise and blame the same thing. He claimed that he could turn any weak argument into one of strength. His aim was to develop his pupils' debating abilities. Protagoras, irrespective of his popularity as a teacher of rhetoric, became associated with skepticism. He held the truth that a man is the measure of all things. This led to the conclusion that there were no objective standards to judge by. Protagoras' response to that view was the standard of advantage, which is self-interest and expediency, and this is what is good. However, he qualified this by saying that in making judgments we naturally know what is morally correct and that this should be our guide. Sophists shared many different viewpoints regarding society. Some held the view that man as a natural creature was subject to the laws of nature and that he must obey these laws. On the other hand, man was a member of the polis, the city, and the laws under which he lived were governed by convention or custom. Nomos and physis, the big contrast between these two views. Another view is that nothing really exists, meaning that reality, truth, or objectivity don't really exist. And finally, another view taught by some sophists was that men have the same human nature and therefore any distinction between them should be abolished. Others saw men as representative of the animal world and human law as necessary to restrict their animal instincts. Protagoras, for example, believed that men left to their own natural instincts would destroy themselves. Therefore, for him, laws were absolutely necessary for men to live in a civilized society. Another famous Sicilian, Gorgias of Leontini, developed a new style of argument. He initiated the practice, which continues into the early 4th century, of composing speeches for mythical or imaginary occasions. The surviving examples reveal a lively intellectual climate in the late 5th and early 4th centuries, in which oratory served to display new ideas, new forms of expression, and new methods of argument. This tradition of intellectual oratory was continued by the 4th century educator Socrates and played a large role in later Greek and Roman education. In addition to this intellectual oratory, at about the same time, the practice also began of writing speeches for real occasions in public life, which we may designate as practical oratory. Which were these real occasions? First, the assembly and the council, the bulli. Second, the courts. And third, the festivals, the burial ground, or the public cemetery. The role of these institutions was closely associated with the Athenian democracy. You may all know this, since it was important and necessary for any Athenian to speak in public and be trained in the art of rhetoric and persuasion. At this point, we need to go through the development of the Athenian constitution very briefly and very lenient. It's not an in-depth analysis, just to see the evolution that worked in parallel with the development of legal constitution. It started with Solon, early 6th century. Solon made a lot of things, we don't need to get into this, but two were the main important reforms that relate with the development of what we call practical oratory. A major change in the administration of justice by Solon was the introduction of the graphi. Graphi was a public action which allowed anyone to bring a prosecution in certain cases where previously only the alleged victims could act. What does this mean? Any Athenian citizen who believes that any politician or any other Athenian citizen does something to harm the interests of the city or the constitution or the citizens as a whole, he can go to the court and prosecute this person. Of course, this may not be done directly, but someone else on his behalf can take this role. But what is important is that this measure gives access to all Athenian citizens, theoretically at least, to be able to become prosecutors of all the politicians and all the people who held a public office. If we take it to our day to day, it means, let's say that we, each one personally, could prosecute any of the 300 of our bulli or all the politicians for not doing their duty toward the city and toward the constitution of Athens. Of course, the example is not a good one in the sense that at that time it was a direct democracy, whereas now we have a representative democracy, and these councillors there are supposed to represent us and fight for us in that sense, even though in practice it doesn't always work like this. But that was the major reform that was ever done in classical Athens, beginning of 6th century, in the between archaic and classical. All the Athenian males were able to participate in a prosecution of anyone who might hurt the system, the police, the laws. The second important reform Solon did was the possibility of making an appeal. Until that time, they had an arbitration if they had a dispute, people between them. meaning they would find both an arbitrator and he would make the decision who was to be the responsible for the offense, and to give a punishment or propose something that they were both committed to accept it. And that was it. So once Solon came, said, okay, now if anyone is not satisfied by the justice attributed by an arbitrator, he can take the case to court. In other words, with Solon, courts take action. At the same time, he creates for the first time the assembly, the ecclesia, where all the Athenians gathered to make decisions about their internal and external politics. So the people were there to hear, to speak, and the others to vote. So we have courts with the assembly, and we have the first bully, the first council, which consisted only of 400. So there was a council at that time, even though there was a direct democracy. And what were they doing? They're preparing the agenda for the ecclesia. So in a way, it was an introductory role to what the assembly was doing. These, even though they seem very easy steps to us now, at that time, if we consider that Solon was the one who came and freed all those Athenians who were enslaved because they had debts to the landowners, and the society was a society of the extremes, of the aristocrats, the landowners, and the poor. And if we think that at that time Solon came to give access to the people, to have a public voice, that's what he gave. They made them, he gave them the opportunity to speak in public and fight for justice and for the good of all the city. Second step towards democracy, and as you see, each step that brings the establishment of the Athenian constitution, what it does, it gives more and more an access to public voice, to everybody. At the same time, this is confirmed by legal reforms, written, and we have written law as well. So it's law, rhetoric, and democracy. All together, the evolution parallel of all these three dimensions. Cleisthenes, what did he do? He's supposed to be the establisher of the democracy. He did one important thing, you may all know, I just need to emphasize this. He divided Attica in 10 tribes, each one represented by all different social classes of Athenians, meaning what? That all the officials and all the politicians would be selected by a list by lot of each tribe, which means that all the Athenian citizens of different origins and social backgrounds could be represented. Become what? They could become judges, they could become councillors, they could become generals, they could become the office of the 9 archons, which was every year they changed. And if we think that the population in the 5th century was 35,000 Athenian citizens, we are talking about males over the age of 18, within a short period of time they would all exchange and take in turn the position of all different offices, meaning they would all rule and be ruled. And this is what democracy, we know that it means that the people rule, but it's literal, it's not metaphorical, because literally they all take this position. If they take this position, they need to be able to persuade. Otherwise, they lose it. So rhetoric and democracy is there together, as you mentioned in the beginning. The third person is Ephialtes. Just before, he's with a group of Pericles. Just before Pericles, what did he do? We had the Areopagus. Areopagus was the guardian of the laws of Athens, the aristocratic council, which even today, to this day now, if you say Areopagitis, is supposed to be the highest office one can have, even in modern Greece. You use the same term. So that was the most aristocratic, the power which actually within 5th and 4th centuries, going towards the end of the 4th century, the Areopagus was there when there were times of crisis, even to convict people to death if they decided that they were a threat to the safety of the city. So they were the safeguard of the city and of the laws and of the constitution. So what does the Ephialtes do? He removes most of its juridical powers from Areopagus, leaving only a few, basically some religious jurisdiction and homicide trials. All the rest go to the courts, basically, and the assembly. What happens is that as democracy develops, the power moves gradually from the council and the assembly towards the courts. So in the 4th century, where it is believed that Athens, having lost the Peloponnesian War, was in a crisis, actually we have a power of the democracy, because in all aspects the courts control everything. And why does this matter? We'll come to this, where the courts, who participated in the courts, and why is it important for the courts to have the power. And the next person is Pericles, the leader. We all know Pericles. What did he do? He gave money to the people. But for what? In order to participate in the assembly, you would lose your day, meaning you would lose your job, your work, your daily wage. So he compensated people in order to participate in the assembly, in order to be judges. He gave salary for that, and he gave also salary to participate in democratic festivals. By this, what did he do? He made actually all the citizens be active, participate in the system, be part of the democracy. He had the support of the people, of the demos, not of the aristocrats, even though he was from an aristocratic origin, and he was supposed to be the best orator ever. They really admired him when he was talking, and he persuaded them, what? To start the more absurd war, Peloponnesian War. The war that brought the disaster to the whole of Greece. And he persuaded them to start this war. Of course, it was for him the end of him, but still they took it to the end, the Athenians, until they were So the reason why I wanted to show this brief representation of the evolution of democracy is because we need to understand that all this step, democracy first of all does not happen in one day. It is a matter of a process that started from the 6th century and completed towards the middle of 4th century. It took 2.5 centuries until it was fully developed and until the whole power of the city was with the courts. During this time, step by step, what was important? It was important for people to talk. It was important for people to persuade, to speak. And coming to this, Pericles was the last politician of the old tradition. After Pericles, we have the so-called new politicians. Who were they? They were not from an aristocratic origin. They were not generals, as they used to be, but they were rich men, basically from trade, and men who could speak and persuade the people. And this is why in the 4th century the term for a politician was rhetor, not politicians. Even though in the 5th century we have political figures and the term of officials as axiomaturchi, in the 4th century it's rhetores, the name for the politicians. Meaning that with the evolution of the democracy, with the evolution of the legal code, which was written down and kept in the marketplace, in the agora, with this we have the full development of the oratory as well. So why is the art of rhetoric important? Because democracy is important. This is one possible answer. So the democracy contributed to the development of rhetoric, but rhetoric helped and contributed to the development of democracy. Would that mean anything for us today? I don't know, just a question mark. So why should someone study classical oratory? I mean, okay, they were there in the assembly, they were in the bully, they were in the courts, and they were giving speeches. Why would we be interested in reading these speeches? And on the other hand, having heard all this about the Sophists and how they dealt with arguments and how they could argue both for the positive and the negative side of the same point, meaning they were not telling the truth. So they were telling lies. So what is rhetorics? Are the persons who tell lies? Politicians were the persons who told lies to their people and deceived them? Could that be the case? There is one aspect that I believe is the key, at least for me, why rhetoric is even classical oratory is for us valuable today. Of course, they try to deceive the judges, for example, in courts, because it was a dispute. The one would die and the other would survive. So you would need to win, meaning that you would use all possible rhetorical means. But as we'll see to the kinds of proofs that they were used, you would appeal to common shared ideas and views. The ideology must have derived from what all the Athenian citizens shared and believed. In that sense, these speeches, all these different kind of speeches, show us today what was the social structure, the moral views, the social values that were important, the political aspect of how those people reacted to what was democracy, what was for them justice. Because, of course, the people who were trying to persuade the judges, they would not tell things that would be common knowledge for them or shared by them. They would tell them things that they would share and they would believe in. In that sense, these texts reveal us all this value system of the classical times, which is even today the same. It hasn't changed because it's about humans. It's about disputes, it's about power, it's about justice. And the questions on what is justice have been posed since then and are the same until now. In that sense, it might give us a different approach of how they dealt in a rhetorical way, meaning in an artful way, with these issues. The person who gives us information about the art of rhetoric is Aristotle from the 4th century, apart from all the others I have just mentioned, the early Sophists, even the pre-Socratic philosophers. Aristotle wrote a treatise in the 4th century called Rhetoric. So it is a treatise on rhetoric, 3 volumes, and he gives us all the information based on what? Based on the speeches that were delivered during the 5th century, meaning that from the practical oratory, these books have given a theoretical approach. So in his treatise, he distinguishes 3 types of rhetoric: the ceremonial, epidectic, the forensic. Here we have Pericles speaking. This is the famous. Yes. The forensic, dikanikos logos, which is in the courts, and the deliberative, symbolievtikon, which is the speeches that were delivered in the assembly and in the bully. I will just give a very few points on each of these types of rhetoric, but I would like us to have a look at some texts which show more than that. An epidictic oratory was all the speeches that were composed to be delivered at a festival. The most representative type of speech of this oratory was the funeral oration. We already mentioned the funeral oration of Pericles in the Peloponnesian War before he died, basically, where he praised the city of Athens, the constitution, and the Athenians themselves as citizens. And also in other festivals like Panathenea, we have epidictic speeches, and of course in the Olympic Games we have Olympic speeches. What is this speech about? It's an orator would use an epidictic speech to show off, to show his art, to show his rhetorical means of persuasion. So it was a kind of intellectual game as well, but it did also have a very specific aim. It praised the past, but could be used also for the future, the present and the future. In what sense? In the sense that it did have also a deliberative tone, meaning that you praise those who died, but you give some advice to the current people what they can do and imitate them. So it's a kind of example that can be used even now. If you go to a place where they honor a person or they honor a building or someone who made something special, they would praise this, and that would be set as a kind of example for the others to imitate. So it's not only epidactic in the sense that an orator shows off, but also a means of giving advice, counseling the audience how to act in the present, and particularly epidactic rhetoric has the aim of the present, of giving advice for the present. I chose a passage from the latest funeral oration that has been saved, preserved to us. It is from the late 4th century BC. It is one of the two which actually was delivered on the battlefield after the Lamian War, defeating, and it was a means to persuade the people to defeat and go on against the Alexander, against Macedon. Even though they won, Leosthenes, the general, died. And Hyperides was a very close friend of Leosthenes, so it's the only one, and it's a very representative speech. Why? Because we have the praise of this man. Normally in the funeral speeches of the 5th century, you praise the whole of the city, all the citizens, and this is the beginning of the democracy. Moving towards the end of the 4th century, and this actually takes us to the end of the classical period as well, there is a turn to the individual, and the individuals who can help and contribute. And another example of the same period is the orator Lycurgus. Lycurgus, who actually played the role of one who had all the authorities in order to help the city get stronger after the defeat at Heronia in 338. So I read this passage. As for the city, there is not enough time now to survey individually its earlier accomplishments throughout all Greece, nor does this occasion call for a long speech. This was the practice of earlier funerals. That was what they were doing. So he doesn't do this. And it's not easy for one man alone to narrate and call to mind deeds so numerous and so great. But I will not refrain from speaking about the city Samaria. Just as the sun goes over all the world, determining the seasons appropriately and establishing all the right conditions, supplying reasonable and fair-minded humans with birth and substance and crops and all other things needed for life. In the same way, too, our city continuously punishes the wicked, gives aid to the just, dispenses equality instead of injustice to all, and provides universal safety to the Greeks at its own risk and expense. As for the public deeds of the city, as I said, I will refrain from detailing them. Instead, I will now focus my speech on Leosthenes and the others. Now, where should I begin my speech? What should I bring up at first? Should I discuss in detail the ancestry of each of them? No, I suppose that is facile. If I were praising some other people who came from many places to settle one city, each contributing a different heritage to the mix, then I would need to trace the background of each man by man. But since I'm speaking about Athenian men, who thanks to their common origin and their birth from the land itself, have unsurpassable nobility, I believe that praising the ancestors individually is beside the point. Should I mention their education and how they were raised and educated in great moderation when they were children, as some are accustomed to do? But I suppose everyone knows that we educate our children with this goal, that they may become brave men. Since these men were distinguished in wartime virtue, it is obvious that they were taught well as children. I think therefore it is simplest to narrate their courage in war and how they were responsible for many benefits to their fatherland and to the other Greeks. The reason why I chose this is to show the shift from the past, the encomium of the ancestrals, of the city, of the laws, of the education, of the best ever, to summarize all this by this metaphor of the sun and focus on the individuals. What does this show? I believe the shift of political circumstances, social circumstances, meaning that rhetoric changes depending on the social and political context. It cannot be the same. It has to adapt to the new events, the new circumstances in social and public life. Second type, I believe I have another 10 minutes, 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Deliberative rhetoric is the rhetoric which is, as we said before, delivered in the assembly. And what does a politician do? Because these orators are the politicians. They give advice. In order to give advice, according to Aristotle, they need to know about everything. They need to know about incomes, about trading, about financials of the other Greek cities, about the constitutions of all the other city-states, in order to know what would be the best move. One idea that is very, very important for giving advice is what is expedient, what is useful, what is the best for the sea. So the whole argument, and I believe this is interesting if we analyze modern political speeches, how is the idea of expediency given? What is the argument about what is the best? I will only refer here to Demosthenes, who is talking. There are 2 points he develops very much in his political speeches. The possible. He argues about what is possible, and he argues showing numbers. And we have speeches with very detailed numbers about costs, about ships, about men. And this is possible, but this is not possible. So we have to choose about what is possible. So the topos of possibility is the one, and the other is the keros, the right time, and the right time and the right move. And generally the keros is a view of Socrates, which is also related with ethical and moral values apart from giving advice. And we have this example here, which is worth reading very, very briefly. Hence the result is that in the assembly, your self-complacency is flattered by hearing none but pleasant speeches. But your policy and your practice are already involving you in the gravest peril. Therefore, if such is your temper now, I have nothing to say. But if, apart from flattery, you are willing to hear something to your advantage, I am ready to speak. For though the state of our affairs is in every way deplorable, and though much has been sacrificed, nevertheless it is possible, if you choose to do your duty, that all may yet be repaired. And what I'm going to say may perhaps seem a paradox, but it is true. So here it's the argument on what is true and what is best for you, instead of giving you pleasant speeches. Last type is the forensic one, and here to say a few things very, very briefly is that the courts, how many do you think the judges would be in Athenian court? A number, just a number.
500.
No, a few hundreds, it depends on the court.
Yeah, so in a private case you would have 301 and it's multiple, and in a public case you would have 501 and it's multiple, and we have a case of 6,000 Athenian citizens in the generals of the battle at Arginusae. So you need, I mean, here we are like, let's say 20. You need someone in court had to persuade at least 300 people. Imagine how many more we need to be in order to be 300. In public cases, 500,000. Who were these? Lawyers? People who knew justice, who knew law? No. They were simple Athenian citizens, male, over 30, and they had to give an oath that they would vote according to the laws and the decrees of the city, and without taking any bribes at all. Meaning anyone, given that Pericles, as we saw, gave the salary so that even the poorer citizens could be part of these courts, all those who would not like the rich people would be there as well. And this is important because in public cases, you understand that defendants would be politicians. Most of them were accused that they had made money out of their policy. It's not new. We know this even in our day. So you would have as judges the poor citizens who would felt that they were not made justice by the others. So it's a very complex audience you have there, and you have to persuade them. Why? Because if you don't, you may be killed. Simple as that. Death would be the penalty for many, many cases of treason, because politicians with the process of isangelia, they were tried for treason. And treason could be anything. Anything that you would do against your city, even if you would embezzle money or property, or if your conduct was against the laws, would be treason. And the end of such a decision was not something, it was something that would be decided afterwards, the punishment, and in most cases, what they appealed for was death. So you had to persuade all this. How would you do it? And we do have many, many instances of what we call dicastic thoribus, meaning the judges were getting up, shouting at the speakers, even they threw tomatoes against them, and they shout, "Oh, what we do?" They were doing this in court. How do you get these people with you? With a speech. This is why they needed the art of rhetoric. But this is the art of rhetoric that not only addresses the judges, but has the effect of taking them with your side. So we have two different kinds of proof. We have the artful and the artless proof. The artless would be the ones that would not need the art of rhetoric, meaning witnesses, oaths, evidence, contracts, laws, decrees, things like that. The artful was the speech. Of course, no one could write a speech to have this result, meaning win the case. That was the main aim, to win the case. Not to be killed, not even to be exiled, would be another punishment, not to be fined with a huge amount of money that would take your property away, which would be different ways of punishment. So the speeches were written by specific professional orators and rhetoricians, the descendants of the Sophists we saw before, who were paid a lot of money, but with this amount of money they guaranteed to their client that he would make it. So first of all, we have the professional speech writers. Then we have three kinds of proofs. The one is on ethos. What does a characterization? They create a persona, not necessarily what the person was, but a persona that would appeal to the case and bring the victory for their client. Then we have the pathos, emotions. Emotions created by the age, by the gender, by the circumstances, by the threat, by whatever would make someone feel distrust or trust the defendant. And also logos, arguments, which these arguments now are the evolution, the development of the arguments from the Sophists. The eikos, probability. As I said before, since I am short, it's not possible that I have killed someone who is twice as me. So probability, it looks like this cannot have happened because this is how it looks. Meaning, in court is my version against yours. If my story is more elegant, is more funny, because you have thousands of people and you want to make them entertain themselves. You can't have them there just listen to boring stuff. This was done, this and that and that and that, so I'm innocent. You have to make them laugh. You have to make them take your role. I will finish with just reading this passage. Please give me these minutes. I believe it's worth it. It's from a case of adultery. Very, very hot, but hot in full meaning, because the nightmare of the Athenian citizen was adultery. Not because of ethical issues, they didn't care about morality, because they had so many women anyway, so they wouldn't mind that. But adultery would mean that possibly not an ophos, a bastard could come into the oikos. The oikos was the basic of the democratic city-state. So what does this mean? Property and religion. This has to be done by the genuine members of the oikos, of the house, or the household, the concept of the house as well. So if someone who is not from the same blood comes into, then he interrupts this tradition and the democracy fails. So the nightmare of an Athenian, and there were many adulteries, and this is why Aristophanes have so many women just fooling around with other men, because that was their nightmare. So we have a poor guy here, poor guy, that's how Lysias makes him appear, a poor guy in the sense that he is the husband, and he has to convince the jurors for what? The law gives him the right, if he catches the adulterer in the act, before witnesses, of course, because I can tell that I caught him in the act and kill all the people. He could kill the person, but he had to be caught in the act, and he had to confess that actually he was doing this. The law gave also other prospects. I mean, you could bring the case to court, you could give a fine, you could compensate the man privately, give him a fortune if you were rich. But he does not say that. He killed the man. However, the relatives had the right, if they thought that the man had been unjustly killed, meaning he was not guilty of adultery, he could take this man to court, and if he was found guilty, he would be put to death. That would be his punishment, because then it would be a willful homicide. So, Lysias creates a persona and the narrative, which is, I want you now, after having all this is my last request, just be in the position of judges and imagine that there are here another, let's say, 450 people with you. Imagine how would you react if, I'll try to read it as good as possible, if you heard this. So, this guy is called Ephiletos. I don't know if it's his name here. He's the husband, I said. When I decided to marry men of Athens and I brought a wife into my house, during the early period my attitude was neither to annoy her, nor to allow her too much freedom to do as she wished. I protected her to the best of my ability and kept watch as was proper. But when my child was born, from then on I trusted her and I placed all my property in her care, believing that this was the strongest bond of affection. And to begin with, men of Athens, she was the best of all women. She was a skilled and thrifty housekeeper who kept careful control over everything. But when my mother died, and her death has been the cause of all my troubles, for it was when my wife attended her funeral that she was seen by this man and eventually corrupted. He kept watch for the serving girl who used to go to market and passed messages and seduced her. Now, first gentlemen, this too I must tell you, I have a small house with 2 floors, with the upstairs and downstairs equal in size as far as the men's and women's quarters are concerned. When our baby was born, the mother nursed it. So that my wife would not run any risk going downstairs when she had to bathe him, I lived upstairs and the women below. And this had become so normal that often my wife would go off downstairs to sleep with the baby to give him the breast so that he wouldn't cry. And this went on for a long time, and I never once suspected, but was so gullible that I thought my own wife was the most decent woman in the city. After a time, gentlemen, I came home unexpectedly from the country. After dinner, the baby cried and howled. He was being tormented by the maid on purpose to make him, because the man was in the house. Afterwards, I discovered all of this. And I told my wife to go off and give the baby the breast to stop him crying. To start with, she refused, as if she were pleased to see me back after a long absence. When I grew angry and told her to go, she said, "Oh yes, so that you can have a go at the serving girl here. We have groped here before too, when you were drunk." I, for my part, laughed while she stood up, went out and closed the door, pretending she was joking, and then turned the key. And I thought nothing of all this, and suspected nothing, but went to sleep gladly, having come from the country. When it was almost daylight, she came and opened the door. When I asked why the doors banged in the night, she said that the lamp by the baby had gone out, and so she had got a light from the neighbors. I said nothing and believed that this was true. But I thought, gentlemen, that she was wearing makeup, though her brother was not yet dead 30 days. Still, even so, I said nothing about the matter, but went off without a word. After this, gentlemen, time passed, and I remained in complete ignorance of my misfortunes. Then an elderly female slave came up to me. She had been sent secretly by a woman with whom Eratosthenes was having an affair, so I heard later. This woman was resentful, and thought herself hard done by, because he no longer visited her frequently as before. So she kept watch until she found out the cause. This female approached me near my house, where she was looking out for me. "Euphilitos," she said, "don't think I have approached you through any desire to meddle, for the man who is insulting you and your wife is actually an enemy of ours. If you seize the girl who goes to market and works for you and put her to the test, you will discover everything. It is," she said, "Eratosthenes of Oi who is doing this. Not only has he corrupted your wife, but also many others. He makes a profession of it." I could read more, but I would like to end with this and think how you would judge this man. Thank you very much.